So we're standing here on Catholic Hill, and this really is one of Helena's most historic places, and a lot of people don't realize how historically important this whole area is. Behind me is the St. John's building, but before this building was here, this was the convent for the Sisters of Charity from Leavenworth, Kansas, and also the first boarding school for white girls in the territory of Montana, St. Vincent's Academy. In 1869, there were 5 Sisters of Charity who came to Helena with a threefold mission, actually. They were supposed to treat the sick, take care of the sick, take care of orphans, and teach children. And so on this little hillside here, they accomplished all of those missions, actually. The first thing that they did was establish the boarding school. And the school, St. Vincent's Academy, had students until the earthquakes in 1935. And there's a really interesting story, I think, about the earthquakes, which took most of the buildings here on Catholic Hill. But St. Vincent's Academy had a number of girls boarding there, and one of the earthquakes that happened in October of 1935 happened about 10 o'clock at night, and so the girls were getting ready for bedtime. And the earthquake hit, all of the lights went out. They had been doing construction on the building, and the whole side of the building had scaffolding on the outside of it, and part of the walls had been taken down, so there was open air. And it was pitch dark. The nuns took candles, and they led the girls from the top floor down. They bypassed the one door that could have led them out into nothing. And they all safely got out. And the next morning, when they looked at the damage and they saw that this whole wall had fallen, actually, because it was weakened from the construction, they would have just stepped out into nothing. So the nuns always felt that there really was divine intervention, and all of the girls were saved. So the building that's behind me now, St. John's Hospital building, was rebuilt. It was rebuilt in about 1937, just after the earthquake. And it took the place of the original hospital, which was across the way, actually on the hilltop that we'll see in a little bit. So St. John's Hospital operated here until the 1960s. And then, like a lot of Catholic institutions across Montana, across the United States, it closed. The boarding school never did open again after the earthquake, but the high school, the Catholic high school, did build a new high school. And that was the place where Capital High School is today. That was actually built as the Catholic high school. Okay, so this is Catholic Hill proper. And on this hillside, as I mentioned before, the 5 Sisters of Charity came. There was already a framed church here, Catholic church. But the sisters really were brought here by the bishop, who believed that the mining camp was a pretty rough place here, and there were not that many women, but the young girls really needed role models because they didn't really have any adults to look up to. So the sisters were brought here, as I mentioned, for this threefold purpose, but also as to serve as role models for young girls in the community. And so on this hilltop, in addition to the first cathedral, which was built in about 1874 over on the east side of the apartment complex, pretty soon St. John's Hospital was built over to the north side, and to the east, to the south would have been the orphanage, originally called St. Ambrose's Orphanage, but later it became St. Joseph's, which moved out to where Shopko used to be, moved out there in about 1890. But there was the orphanage here, so that fulfilled the one purpose to take care of orphans. The hospital fulfilled the mission to take care of the sick. And behind me, the building that is still standing here was the hospital laundry building, where the sisters did all of the sheets, bed sheets, and towels and things connected to the hospital, their hospital duties. But in the center of this, what is now a parking lot, there was a frame house that had been used as a priest's residence. And the sisters took that over, and from about 1872 until 1878, the sisters had the territorial contract to care for what were called the indigent insane. And so all of the mentally ill patients that had no one to care for them were sent here by the territorial courts, and the sisters took care of them. And it was a very, very dangerous occupation for them. We can read journals that the sisters kept, and some of the patients would escape. They, of course, had no care of the mentally ill back then. The only thing they could do was to bind their wrists and bind their ankles and tie them to their chairs or to their beds so that they didn't harm other patients, themselves, and the sisters. And so there were these really harrowing stories of how prisoners, not prisoners, but inmates they were called, got out and tried to harm the sisters. So anyway, that went on until about 1878 when Warm Springs was founded, and then the sisters didn't have to do that type of work anymore. But there's an interesting story connected to that history. And most people don't know that history. People who actually live in these apartments often think that there was a cemetery here. There was never a cemetery here, but after the orphanage moved in about 1890, St. Anne's Infants Home was here. And there were children that did die, but they were not buried here. They were buried in the Catholic cemetery. So at any rate, never a cemetery on this property, but there is this one story. I had the opportunity to interview a person who lived in one of the apartments over on the east side there where St. John's Hospital used to be. And he had no idea of the history of this area. And so he was telling me that one day he and his wife had had a new baby, and his wife had taken the baby for an outing, and he was in the apartment mopping the floor, the kitchen floor. And he's mopping away, and all of a sudden he began to smell this horrible, horrible odor. He said it was the worst thing you can imagine, and he couldn't figure out where it was coming from, and he almost didn't want to know where it was coming from. It was so terrible. And as he was mopping, he was smelling this pine sol, from his bucket, but then he couldn't smell the pine sol anymore, and he could smell this horrible, horrible odor. So he said he looked over to his front door, and he noticed that the door was ajar, and there was someone standing on the other side of the doorway. So he went to the door and flung it open, and the person standing there was this very odd-looking man who was kind of strangely dressed. He had on what used to be a white shirt that was kind of torn, and he was just kind of wild-looking, and he wouldn't make eye contact. And the apartment tenant asked him, well, what do you want? And he said, I want to come in. He said, well, what do you want? I can't let you into my house unless you tell me what you want. Well, I guess you're not going to let me in, the guy said, and he turned around and sort of strode off, and the tenant shut the door really fast. And then he thought better of it. He thought, I better see where this guy is headed. So he quickly opened the door, and there was nobody around, nobody in the parking lot, nobody on the sidewalks. And he said, that was a really strange experience. But he said to me, the thing that really bothered him about it was that in retrospect, he realized that this man was obviously had been abused, because he had these horrible red raw chafe marks around his wrists where he had obviously been tied. So when I told Richard about the history of the hilltop here and the care of the mentally ill, he had, of course, no idea, but it made the story even scarier to him to think that, there was still some remnant of that use of this hilltop. Over here on that would be the southeast corner, Immaculate Hall was built in about 1890. It was a little bit later, about contemporary with the laundry building behind me here. And when the earthquakes happened in 1935, all of the buildings except for the laundry building and what's now called Immaculate Hall were undamaged. And those are the only two buildings left from that original Catholic Hill. Immaculate Hall was built originally as St. Aloysius Boys' School, and it was used for that purpose for quite a long time. It's kind of interesting because the second and third floors of the building where the classrooms were, the windows on the back there overlook the red light district. And it's kind of an interesting juxtaposition. It just sort of shows you that, you know, there wasn't really the stigma that there is today, at least early on here in the mining camp. And so Immaculate Hall, after the boys' school closed, Immaculate Hall became Carroll College's very first nursing school. And from about 1940 until the 1960s, the nursing students lived up on the top floor, and the classrooms were on the bottom floor. And at that time, Carroll College was not co-ed, and so that's why the school had to be discontiguous from the campus. So we're standing on top of Fire Tower Hill, which is just as adjacent to Catholic Hill. And Fire Tower here was, of course, built in 1874. It was not the first fire tower that was built on this hilltop. It was a necessary thing because Helena was a mining camp. Most of the original buildings were built of log and wood, and they were built close together because this was a very remote and scary place to live, and people wanted to be close to their neighbors. When something caught on fire, so did everything else. So it was important to be able to warn residents that there was fire in the community. But behind me, just down from Fire Tower Hill, is where the high-class red light district was. There were three really important institutions, I guess you would say, or businesses. One of them was Chicago Joe's famous Coliseum. Another one was the famous castle, which sat right about where these modern apartments are, the edge of the apartments here. And the third place was the place that belonged to Lily McGraw, who was the builder who built the Bluestone House, and her house of ill repute was right at the foot of the Bluestone House. The Bluestone House never was a brothel. A lot of people think that it was, but actually it was built as Lily's private residence. She wanted to be close to her place of business, but unfortunately she lost her money maybe in the Panic of 1893 as the house was under construction, and it was never finished. She lost the property, and it had a number of other owners, but no one ever actually lived in it. On the other side here, just down from on the other side of Warren Street, is Molly Burns' house, and that is really one of the great historic gems, architectural gems, I think, in Helena, designed by an architect by the name of Welter, and has two really lovely turrets. A lot of people also think that was a brothel, but actually Warren Street was a dividing line between respectable property on the east side and the red light stuff on the west side. Molly built her house just to the other side of Warren Street in the respectable neighborhood. She wanted to be close to her place of business because she had a serious drinking problem, and she didn't want to have to hire a carriage and lose her way walking home and whatever, so she wanted to build her house close to her business. So that's why she built just to the other side of Warren Street. But there are other very respectable families that lived in that neighborhood too. So this was actually the higher class red light district. There was a lower class red light district, sort of forms a T that runs from what is now the Blackfoot Brewery all the way down to the caretaker's house or the Cotton Top Bakery at the foot of Reader's Alley. So that whole area in between there were low class, kind of scary places actually. houses of prostitution, and also cribs, little one-room offices where the women worked. So on the east side of the apartment complex here was the Cathedral of the Sacred Hearts of Jesus and Mary. And it sat there from about 1874 until it was torn down in 1927. But it wasn't used anymore after 1914, when the Cathedral of St. Helena was finally finished. And so the first cathedral here really was the receptacle in a vault underneath it for all of the priests that died between 1874 and 1914. And there were a number of priests that died and were buried in a vault underneath the cathedral, the old cathedral here. So when they tore down or deconsecrated this church, they removed the bones of all of the priests, and they were reburied out at Resurrection Cemetery, all except for one. And that was Father Rapagliosi, who was a missionary among the Blackfeet, and he died under rather mysterious circumstances. His family always believed that he had actually been poisoned. He was in delicate health. There was never any proof that there was any foul play, but his family always believed that he had died under suspicious circumstances, to say the least. So anyway, his bones, as far as I know, nobody knows where they are. And there are stories among people who live in this apartment complex that sometimes they see a dark-suited man on the balconies here. And I always like to think that it's Father Rapagliosi who might have been left here by mistake.